Hi, I'm Tom Birkeland, author of An Introduction to the Policy Process and professor of public policy at North Carolina State University. I hope you enjoy the book, and I hope you find these videos useful. Well, welcome back. This video is about the role of groups and power in agenda setting and problem definition. Group politics is central to our studies of the policy process. Most of our theories of the policy process rely on the idea that interest groups, groups of people that come together to promote a particular interest, are the driving force behind politics, and especially the kind of politics that characterizes public policy making, which is the politics of deciding what the government should do about problems, and in fact the debate over whether things are problems, and if so, whether the government should do something about those problems. This continues our discussion of agenda setting, and I think further reinforces my idea that this is a particularly fascinating subject in the study of public policy. So let's talk about groups and power in agenda setting. Now, we know that some groups have more power than others in politics and policymaking. And I should pause here to note that groups are really important in the policy process. Most of what motivates politics, what drives politics forward in policy-making realms, is group politics. So it's groups that we're concerned with, interest groups, as many people call them. In Europe and Britain in particular, we call them pressure groups. But groups are important to the process in most democracies. Right, and we know that these groups are more powerful than others. You know, there's some powerful ones, some less so. But what is power? And why do groups have some more power than others? And why is power so important in agenda setting in particular? It's a really important question. It's really important because politics is the study of who gets what. And power then is the ability to get what you want and to prevent others from getting what they want. The who gets what idea is taken from Harold Lasswell, who described politics as the study of who gets what, where, when, why, and how. And power is the idea then to pursue those goals. So we can reduce politics to who gets what. Who gets benefits from the government, who gets things. Benefits can include things like, tax cuts and, tangible benefits, but they can also be more symbolic and things like rights and recognition. And some of those debates over rights and recognition are the most contentious in our political system. Take, for example, the civil rights movement, or the women's rights movement, or the movement for LGBT rights. There were groups, very powerful groups of people that wanted to prevent women or ethnic and racial minorities or LGBT people from benefiting from certain forms of recognition, such as the recognizing the right to vote, or the right to engage in employment without discrimination, or in the most recent case with the gay rights movement, the right to marry the person you love. These are at the heart of very contentious debates in American politics, and power was evident in all of these, but power changes over time as well, as we've seen in the changes in those fields in the last several decades. But there are differences in group power. We know intuitively that some groups are more powerful than others, and that those differences relate to the resources that groups have available to them. And the most obvious one that you might be thinking of is money. Money is a really important resource for a group to lobby, to advertise, to do all the things it does to provide information to the public about what they do, and provide information to decision makers about what they do and why their position should be adopted. But information is also important. You can have lots of money, but you also need information that you can provide to members of Congress to help them make decisions. And I keep talking about Congress because a lot of these decisions are made in the legislative branch, although information is shared with the executive branch as well. Now, you would think that the size of the membership is a really important measure of a group's power, but I wouldn't make too much of that, because there are two reasons why people join groups. One of them is for direct economic reasons. So groups like the National Association of Manufacturers, for example, will be a relatively small group in terms of numbers of members compared to, say, the numbers of members of the National Rifle Association or the Sierra Club or the ASPCA or something like that. But those groups are very influential. Those members are very influential because they represent employers, and they join a group like the National Association of Manufacturers to press the government for policies, regulations, things like that benefit the manufacturing sector. The airlines have a similar trade group. Oil companies have a similar trade group, and for example, the trade group for the airlines only has relatively few airlines. There aren't that many airlines in the United States, but they're very influential because airlines are an important service, and members of Congress are attentive to the health of that industry. Some groups are joined because of material inducements, and my favorite example of this is the American Automobile Association, the AAA. Many of you are members of the AAA because you joined for the towing. A lot of people, especially if you drive an older car. Funny aside, just today my wife had her car towed by AAA because it wouldn't start, and towed it to the garage to get it fixed. That's why we belong to AAA. But the American Automobile Association also lobbies Congress on behalf of automobile drivers for things like using more of the gasoline tax to support more road improvements. Which a lot of us probably think is a good idea, but some of us would like to see some of those funds, for example, spent on mass transit. So maybe we're not dialed in 100% to the goals of the American Automobile Association, but there's an incentive for us to join the group. AARP, the group of retired persons, is another example of that. If you have an AARP card, you can get discounts at hotels in various places. I'm a member of AARP. You can join when you turn 50. And that's a material inducement. Does that mean that AARP's members all agree 100% on the things that the AARP says about policies relating to retirees? Probably not. So just because they can claim millions of members doesn't mean that they speak with one voice and that they're entirely powerful. In other words, it's not measured by simply weighing the number of members and seeing who has the most. It's more subtle than that. Now, differences in group power also reduce to the congruence of goals with prevailing ideas and values. In other words, the group's goals should be in some way congruent with prevailing ideas and values if the group is likely to be on the winning side of a lot of policy disputes. This is what E.E. Schatzsnyder calls the mobilization of bias. Now, some groups are not congruent with prevailing ideas and values, such as gay rights organizations or back in the 50s, civil rights organizations. But over time, social attitudes may converge toward the position being taken by the group. An example I've used in a lot of my teaching is the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, or NORML, which has been advocating for marijuana legalization since the early 1970s. And when I was in high school in the 70s, the idea that marijuana would be legalized seemed kind of absurd. It was criminalized in all the states. Some states were a little bit more loose than others, but it was nowhere near as prevalent as it is today, with more and more states legalizing it first for medicinal reasons and then later for recreational reasons. And so the federal government hasn't quite come around to it, but you can imagine a situation in which the federal government might come closer to that position now because the prevailing ideas and values have become more congruent with the goals of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. And that's how a lot of change happens. So the lesson there is that just because your group is unpopular now doesn't mean it will be unpopular forever, although in some cases a group will remain unpopular forever. The American Communist Party would never be particularly powerful, for example. But there are some ways to think about power that are not as obvious as you might think. I think when most of us think about power, we think about what we call the first level of power. And what follows here is derived from two classic works in the field. One, an article in 1962 by Bacharach and Baratz, and the second, a book by John Gaventa called Power and Powerlessness. So when we think about political power, we usually think about one level of power that Bacharach and Baratz talk about, which is an actor, we'll call him A, makes actor B do something he or she doesn't want to do. So the application of power in that way would be, for example, the government makes you pay your taxes. If you don't pay your taxes, you pay a penalty. We say it's a voluntary system of taxes, but if you get caught not paying your taxes, you can be in trouble. Or let's say the government drafts you because we need military personnel. That would be an obvious example of actor A making actor B doing something he or she doesn't want to do. You may not want to join the military, but during various periods in our national history, people have been required to do so. But there's also another level which may not be quite as obvious, which is when actor A prevents B from doing the things he or she wants to do. Forms of ethnic and racial discrimination, I would argue, are characterized by this. That a state back in the 60s that required that buses or schools or other public facilities be segregated on the basis of race. Let's say I'm a student and I want to go to the better high school in town, and the community and the school board says, nope, you go to the black school, the white kids go to the white school. This is the very issue that was at the heart of cases like Brown versus Board of Education, where A was preventing B from doing the things she wanted to do, and that was getting an education at an equal school. Not a separate school, but an equal school. The courts, of course, found that separate but equal was not equal. And for years after Brown, places still discriminated against people on the basis of race, and there's still a lot of that going on. But that's an example of where actor A would prevent actor B from doing what he or she wants to do. But then there's a third level of power. These two are the two faces of power, but this third level of power is what John Gaventa talks about in his book. And what it looks like is this. Actor A creates and maintains a social structure in which actor B cannot even imagine taking action to pursue his or her own interests. Now, this isn't a conspiracy theory, and it's not Marxian false consciousness in the sense that people don't know their own interests or things like that. But what it does describe is power relations in the United States in the sense that the system is organized in such a way that some issues are addressed in politics and others are written out of politics. This is what Schatzsnyder means by the mobilization of bias. That all forms of political organization have a bias in favor of the exploitation of some kinds of conflict and the suppression of others, because organization is the mobilization of bias. Some issues are organized into politics while others are organized out. So the question for you is, what issues are organized into politics in the United States or in the country in which you live, and what issues are organized out of politics? What doesn't get a hearing in the highest levels of government? What is unlikely to change? I'll give you some examples to think about. In the United States, you don't have a right to health care. You don't have a right to an education. You don't have a right to jobs or housing. And there's no guarantee that the government is going to see to it that you have health care, housing, a job, an education. And so the idea of these things as a matter of right is structured so that it's not up for debate in American politics. People will make the assertion, but the bias, if you will, the tendency of the system is not to provide these systems at the governmental level, not to provide these services, but rather these services are provided when they're provided in a particular way, with health insurance largely through the private market, with education through locally organized public schools where there might be a high degree of variation from one school to the next. There are some issues that simply don't make the agenda because they're organized out of politics. So why does this all matter? It matters because powerful groups can shape the agenda. And not only that, but powerful groups can influence the depiction of public problems so that they can influence the nature of alternative solutions to problems. What this means is that if you have the power to define the problem, in other words, if you are the leader in problem definition, then you're likely also to define the solution, because oftentimes the problem and the solution are contained in the same statement. So people will say the economy is suffering because taxes are too high. So in that case, the obvious remedy is to lower taxes. The solution has been defined into the problem. Powerful groups can make those arguments, and more powerful groups will make an argument stick and gain attention from government more than will less powerful groups. So this is what is at the heart of American political science's debates over pluralism versus elite theory. In other words, is our political system characterized by multiple voices, multiple points of view, in which everybody has a more or less equal opportunity to participate in politics and help shape decisions? Or are decisions in politics made by relatively few people who exert political power to control the agenda? Now, there's a long-standing debate in political science on that goes beyond the scope of the book, although I do get into it a little bit. But the question you want to ask yourself is whether or not that you think America or any country is more characterized by pluralism, that is, multiple points of view, or is more characterized by elite theory, which is that there are relatively few people that are exerting the political power. So I hope you found this useful in thinking about why it is that certain issues come to the agenda and others don't. Political power is at the center of why some issues reach the agenda and others don't. And it's not a bad thing to discuss political power. It's not to say that some groups are wrong in using power. There's no normative dimension to this at all. Rather, I'm looking at this from a more positive or empirical perspective, which suggests that there are some groups that are more influential and have more power over the policy process than do other groups. And understanding that helps us to understand where conflicts come from in politics and how the public policy process addresses those conflicts. So that's a short introduction to the role of groups and power in the policy process. In the next video, we'll delve a little bit more into problem definition, understanding the difference between a problem about which government can do something and a condition about which the government may not be able to do something, and whether that plays a role in whether certain issues reach the agenda. Thanks for watching this video. As always, I really enjoy hearing from students and teachers about the book and about public policy. Feel free to reach out to me at tom@tomberkland.com or visit my website, tomberkland.com. Thanks again for watching.